West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël.
Just moments away, and we'll take you there live. The White House briefing to detail the Biden administration's ambitious climate agenda. The change here is just monumental. From a president who called climate change a hoax to one who says the climate crisis will now be a major part of every administration decision, from transportation policy to military planning to American diplomacy around the world. Let's take a look at just some of the big changes we know are coming. Number one, it's just Trump versus Biden. It's an about face. In 2017, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. President Biden has already said the United States is rejoining. In 2019, President Trump granted the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada through the United States. President Biden has already signed paperwork saying, no, sorry, we're stopping that project. Some new Biden initiatives, and they'll be discussed at the briefing today. This one is ambitious. In the next decade, the Biden administration says it wants to get to 30% conservation of U.S. land and water, much more conservation efforts across the country. One of the actions today will be stopping any new oil and gas leases on federal lands. Already objections from the oil industry about that. This is the big change. The administration says whether it's the Transportation Department, the Pentagon, U.S. diplomats overseas, climate change will be elevated into every conversation. The climate crisis must be a factor, the administration says, in any conversation about purchasing, diplomacy abroad, military installations. That's a huge shift there. This is another case where the American people, frankly, are way out ahead of their government. 72% of Americans in this Yale research say global warming is happening. 72% say it's happening, and 60% of American adults say they'd like their president to do more about this crisis. Let's have a conversation before the briefing with Catherine Hayhoe. She's director of the Climate Center at Texas Tech University. CNN's Phil Mattingly is still with us as well. Catherine, I want to start with you. We're going to get these specific changes today. But as a climate scientist, as someone who has tried to move the country and move citizens on this issue, how much of a difference does it make just the fact that from the president on down, you now have an administration that says this is a crisis, not a hoax?
I think it's absolutely critical. Make no mistake, the last 4 years, there have been cities like Houston and Chicago and Washington, D.C. There have been states, there have been companies like Microsoft. There have been nonprofits and tribal nations and universities who have all been taking action. But to finally have the federal government as a full partner will be a much needed shot of energy.
And Phil, to this point, again, there's so much change happening in these early days, you get dizzy. You're just at the White House now from a stint on Capitol Hill, back at the White House. The president's doing some things today through executive action. If he wants more, he's going to need cooperation in the Congress. What's the likelihood there?
Limited because of the current majority in the United States Senate, which is 50-50 with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking the tie, and one of those 50 is Joe Manchin, who also will soon be the chairman of the key energy committee that oversees it. Obviously, he's protective of his home state. He's protective of his constituents, and I think that underscores the importance for this administration on actions like what they're doing today. Obviously, it's sweeping. Obviously, it brings to the forefront this issue, as you noted, across the agencies, and why that matters is the federal government's a little bit of an aircraft carrier. barrier, and to get it turned around, particularly in such a sharp, divergent way from the last administration, putting the emphasis on it across the agency, across all departments, matters and is important. Raising it as a national security issue matters and is important, as the Pentagon has done since 2014. But there's also the reality of the politics here, and that is they don't have the votes, regardless of whether they're breaking the filibuster or whether they think they can break the filibuster. They don't have the votes on Capitol Hill to move sweeping climate action at this point in time. So what the president is doing with the swipe of the pen matters because it might be as much as he can do, at least in the broad scope of things.
And to that point then, Catherine, what do you see as most significant in the context of, you mentioned some of the local actions happening at the state and local level, the corporate level. Obviously, other players around the world have been moving. But for 4 years, the federal government of the United States essentially hit the pause and the halt button, and many people would say even reversed some modest progress that had been made in this. So when you have the president today talking about no new oil or gas leases on federal lands, action to protect 30% of federal lands and waters by 2030, elevating the climate crisis, essentially making clear it must be part of any conversation across the government right there, reestablishing a presidential council on advisors, memorandum on scientific integrity, the date for a big climate leaders summit, a global summit on the issue. Is there any one thing here, or is it all of the pieces at once that from a science perspective are necessary?
It's that whole set of actions that really matters, because we have to prepare for the impacts that we can no longer avoid that will affect every single one of us, whether Democrat, Republican, Independent, or anywhere in the political spectrum. We need to increase our efficiency. Through efficiency alone, we could cut carbon emissions in the U.S. by up to 50%, it's estimated. And we need to accelerate the transition to clean energy, not only because it's clean, but because it supplies real jobs for real people. There's already more jobs in the clean energy industry than in the oil and gas industry. And just comparing the pipeline, for example, with one of Biden's plans to clean up all of the damaged public lands because of oil and gas. It's estimated the cleanup could create well over 250,000 jobs, whereas the pipeline could create 11,000 temporary jobs, 35 permanent jobs, and some of those 35 jobs would be in Canada.
Catherine, right there, Phil, is touching on one of the conversations we already see happening, the oil and gas industry, both in the Keystone Pipeline decision, now in the decision to halt any new leases for oil or gas on land, saying the Biden administration is anti-jobs. The Biden administration is throwing Americans out of work. Catherine is saying there's a flip side, and there actually could be more jobs in this approach. But in terms of the politics of this here in D.C., the midterm elections coming up, that's one of the reasons I think you're saying that action in Congress is hard to come by.
Look, this has always been the issue with climate, right? Whether it's green jobs, whether it's how do you shift the paradigm to where you can not just talk about how the jobs market will increase if you take these actions, but actually show proof of it happening. And I think this is always kind of the balance that you're trying to strike. You saw the Obama administration try and strike it multiple times. You saw the Trump administration repeatedly talk about how the Paris Climate Accord was just going to wreck American jobs. How do you take that talking point away going into a political season? And again, if you read through what the Biden administration is doing today, they are putting the focus on attempting to kind of move into a new direction and actually create jobs in this marketplace. The other thing they're doing, which I think is very important, is, at least from their perspective, is the equity issue. Laura Barone-Lopez mentioned it last block about COVID. They're doing it again. 40% of the federal funds related to this are going to disadvantaged communities. That matters as well. But if you're talking about, a very slim House majority, and you've got members in Pennsylvania, or you've got members in Texas, or you've got members like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, it is a very, very difficult issue on Capitol Hill to be able to push forward in a sweeping manner to the degree like those like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Sunrise Movement, those folks want them to push in the weeks and months ahead.
And so, Catherine Hayhoe, as you listen to the conversation here in Washington, one of the reasons I love your work is you're out in America, out in conservative America, in Texas. You're a climate evangelist, as you say. Your husband is a pastor in a Christian church. And you talk often about the misinformation that many conservative Christians have been getting, including those who supported, say, President Trump, who listened to hoax for 4 years. How do you think having a new administration that now puts this as a top priority in every conversation across government, again, whether it's procurement at the Department of Transportation, to Pentagon decisions, to American diplomats around the world, how does that change the conversation out there in America where there are skeptics, critics, and opponents of what the new president wants to do?
Well, 7% of people across the country are what the Yale program on climate communication calls dismissive. And they will continue to dismiss each and every effort by anyone to motivate climate action. But as you yourself said, 72% of people already say this is real. But only 40% think it affects them, and less than 35% of people across the whole country ever even have a conversation about it. And here's the connection. If we don't ever talk about it, why would we understand why it matters to us here and now, not just the polar bears and our great-grandchildren, but here today? And if we don't understand why it matters, why would we ever do anything to fix it? So I think there's going to be a lot more positive discussion about constructive, creative, practical solutions today than there would have been 4 years ago. And I think that that's going to help move a lot of people in the middle who say, okay, it might be real, but what are we supposed to do about it that makes sense?
It is Friday, the 12th of November of 2021, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner, the English Bulldog, is our snoozing sous chef, and our daily special is Blue Moon Spirits Fridays, because we are all Nighthawks in the Diner of Life. Yes, we deserve the French 77s no matter how early it is. Yeah, what a week, huh? And I guess we got some more coming ahead of us in the years to come when you think about it. Boy, I will say that the level of dread has decreased dramatically from the years of the former guy. They have not waned completely, alas. And in fact, they may have had a bit of an uptick from these trials going on. You know, I was considering that possibly this racism this blatant racism that we've seen in the courts has maybe always been there. It's easy to say, wow, man, they're really, it's so blatant now, as if it's something new. I fear that possibly it's been as blatant as we see, and we only think it's new because we are seeing it now. State courts, by and large, having cameras within the courtrooms, especially for these more high-profile cases. And, of course, you know, a trial by its very nature has quite a bit of time that's one would consider boring. The fireworks don't usually occur all the time throughout the whole trial. So what we've seen, though, is really, you know, snippets of a day in the courtroom. And I suppose the defense of their utterances could be explained away as like, well, look, we were here for 10 hours or however long it was, and you got like 30 seconds of a tirade. Yeah. Well, we're not really taking it out of context then, are we? Are we? There's the transcript. So we have the Georgia trial, the Mabry murder, where the defense attorney is just blatant and brazen. Don't get brazen with me. Yeah, well, they are in Georgia. Comes out and just says what everybody says out loud down there anyway. Just you don't get to see it on camera on national TV. International, if you want to really get down to it. We don't want any more black pastors in this trial. Famous black people in this trial are going to intimidate the jury by their large blackness. They're hulking up their celebrity, and it's overcoming the reasonable powers of critical thinking of our jury. Well, the judge was not having any of it. And if you saw the clip, there was a bit of a snicker or, you know, a little like harumph from some there. And you could also see the discomfort of the people sitting nearby because they know what he just said and who can hear it, which is the world. Okay, and then you got, I don't know about this judge, Schroeder, out there in Kenosha. Not too sure about him. Now, if you had told me that there was a judge that took the prosecution to task in the course of his career as a jurist, some might think that that's a good thing. Some might. And yet, I don't think that he was really taking the prosecution to task when there was a black defendant, an Asian defendant, a brown defendant, or a commie. Anybody he considers a commie rioter. Yeah. So, highly unbecoming behavior. But he thinks he's Judge Roy Bean, and he can do whatever he wants to do because he's Judge Roy Bean. And he's the smartest plug on the block. Plug on the block? Yeah. The engine block. I don't know where I get these metaphors, but I have them. So he loves to pontificate. Some people say he likes the sound of his own voice. Well, someone has to. And yet, there is no recourse when this kid gets off. Already, they're touting him for public office. We kick out Al Franken's for being a comedian way back before he was ever a senator. We kicked him out for faking that he was going to fondle a starlet's breast on a USO tour. Like that's never been done before. I know it might be unseemly to some. But let's keep it in context, shall we? Oh, the outrage. And it was so outrageous that he had to go. And yet, now they're going to have murderers running for office. I know they've had them before. But this kid, I keep thinking of Trayvon Martin. He was 17. He was holding Skittles and some Arizona iced tea in the rain. That was considered a threat. Now, this Rosenbaum guy that Rittenhouse killed first because he feared so for his life, because the guy threw a plastic bag at him. Yeah, he just got released from the hospital, and that was his belongings. Toothbrush, chapstick, some pants, shirt, underwear, socks. Really a deadly weapon, wasn't it? And this kid had an illegal gun, and he killed somebody with it. Oh, but he's a hero. No, he's not. He's a Nazi Jungen. And I don't know what his mom is, but I don't know why she's not charged also. I was going to be rhetorical and say I don't get it, but we've all been on this earth long enough. We get it. We know exactly what's going on, and it is not good. It seems like we have to cycle through this again. It's going to take years for us to look back on it. If we have enough time to look back on it, we may not be able to by the physical construct of the universe, at least for us. But if we're lucky, we might one day look back on it and go, oh, remember those weird days when people were so weird? And don't think for 1 minute that this is not a Russian operation. It's a Russian operation. It's so everything from the using the rules of our government structure to destroy the government. That's exactly what Putin did. He did it with the judiciary there. He did it with the electoral process. I know it was easy for him because they were just beginning their representative government. They needed help to be able to do it here, and they got it. Who gave it to them? Yeah, the law and order crowd, the supposed patriots of America. Nazis. And now, the physical violence is being normalized. The kid killed 2 people, unarmed, and the one guy who was armed wasn't going to shoot him anyway, and the kid shot him anyway. Re-racked the gun when the other guy, Gage, had his hands up in the air. Also, let's remember, he shot Rosenbaum in the back. Well, I'm sorry, he shot him in the chest. I think he shot the other guy, the skateboarder, in the back. That's okay. He was only a 17-year-old kid with an AK-47, and he feared for his life. Or wasn't it an AR-15? One or the other. Military-grade assault weapon. Let's just call it that. I know someone's going to equivocate and say it wasn't really military. And he only had it because it looked cool. Yeah, it looked cool. He knew exactly what it does. He knows when a bullet from those assault rifles hit you, it liquefies everything. Jesus. They only read about it in their gun porn mags. He went there to kill people. Well, let's just say shoot them, and what happens next? We don't know. And I'll just leave it with this. I'll repeat it. The kid's raised over $500,000, $500,000 for his quote defense. All right. Work in the Peace Corps. Help people drill water wells. Volunteer in old folks' homes. Volunteer at food pantries. You're a loser. Such a loser. Community organizer. You're a loser. Kill people. Cheat the government. Yeah. That's the way to success on the other side. And you will be feted and rewarded handsomely. All right. What's on the menu here on this final day of the week? That's right. Blue Moon Spirits Fridays. Well, as we start off here in the Bistro Cafe, at the top, a new poll shows that 72% of Americans say global warming is happening. Well, I would think it would be more, but I don't know. That's how the disinformation works. Only 72%, but let's put it in another positive way. That's still a lot of people. And I would say that is a mandate. It is. On the rest of the menu, GOP supporters of the infrastructure bill have been hounded daily with violent domestic terror threats. There are real Medicare savings in the sweeping social agenda bill, but not overnight. Damn it. And COVID-19 hotspots around the country offer a worrisome sign of what could be ahead this winter in the United States. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where Poland's far right demands strong borders in the Belarus crisis. Of course, you would expect them to demand that. And the Myanmar military junta sentenced American journalist Danny Fenster to 11 years in prison for spreading what they call false and inflammatory information. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. homepage at netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is the chat room link, and the chat room's monitored by Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly. To the left of that chat room link, across the page, near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, is the link to our Patreon page. And please become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio. We do need it. If you could afford an espresso-type coffee drink, and if you could afford to send those funds our way, it allows us to pay our bills and fly under the radar and continue this resistance against the Nazi takeover of the United States of America, and we are not kidding. Thank you for your generosity. We would truly be unable to do it without you. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, you can do so at Netroots Radio. Tom takes care of that, and we thank Tom for doing so. Follow me on Twitter at Justice Putnam. I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes about 10 minutes before showtime. Get that linked up on Twitter and those other social media platforms. You know which one I'm talking about. And others too. So, follow me on Twitter at Justice Putnam. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Cookbook West. And please do pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, and wherever podcasts can be found. All right, this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is by Alan Fram, and he writes for the Associated Press. The last time Congress approved a major renewal of federal highways and other transportation programs, the votes were 359 to 65 in the House and 83 to 16 in the Senate. It was backed by nearly every Democrat and robust majorities of Republicans. This year's $1 trillion infrastructure bill easily cleared the Senate, 69 to 13, with GOP support, but crawled through the House last week by a 228 to 206 margin with just 13 Republican votes. Those defectors were savaged afterward by former President Donald Trump, hard-right Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, that's a nice way of calling them Nazis, who called them traitors while tweeting their names and office telephone numbers, and one of the 13 says he received death threats. The votes, 6 years apart, and the harsh blowback against Republican mavericks illustrate a GOP in which conservative voices have grown louder and more militant. Oh, you mean the Nazis? Fanned by Trump's bellicose 4 years in office. Bellicose. Growing numbers of progressives have made Democrats more liberal, too, with both shifts fueling a sharpening of partisanship in Washington. Yeah, we've become so liberal, we're almost Eisenhower Republicans. Almost. This madness has to stop, said Representative Fred Upton, a Republican from Michigan, an 18-term moderate who said his offices received dozens of threatening calls following his yes vote. Well, you know what? It's not both sides, Fred. That included one obscenity-laced rant that aides provided in which the caller repeatedly called Upton a traitor and expressed hope that the lawmaker, his family, and aides would die. Upton closed his 2 Michigan offices for a day and reopened them after increasing their security. This year's bill, triple the size of the 2015 measure, is a keystone of President Joe Biden's push to create jobs and build out the nation's roads, water systems, broadband coverage, and other projects. A compromise between Senate Democrats and Republicans, it will send money into every state and is the kind of bill that politicians have loved, and they loved promoting it back home for decades. And Biden plans to sign it on Monday. Democrats say the GOP opposition to the bill is indefensible on policy and political grounds, but has that ever mattered to the Nazis? They don't care. But for many Republicans, infrastructure projects, once an issue the two parties would reflexively work together on for mutual and national benefit, now offers a complex political calculation. When it comes to policy these days, we're basically divided into two tribes. And you stick with your tribe, and you don't try to help the other tribe, said Glenn Bolger, a GOP pollster and strategist. Oh, you mean you're defending being Nazis and fighting against the interest of the United States of America. Tribes? Who made it a tribe? You eliminationist. As president, Trump repeatedly promised his own massive infrastructure plan, but never produced one, making the phrase infrastructure week a Washington synonym for pipe dream. But he opposes the current package and his ability to rally his conservative supporters, which is a nice way of calling them brown shirt shock troops, against those who cross him was a factor as GOP lawmakers decided how to vote. In other words, they have let the terrorists win. Ricardo Alonso Zaldivar of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Blue Moon Spirits Fridays. Medicare enrollees who take expensive medicines could save thousands of dollars a year under the Democrats' sweeping social agenda bill, but those dividends won't come overnight. Instead, they'll build gradually over the decade. Unveiled late last week, the bill's Medicare prescription drug compromise barely survived a pharmaceutical industry lobbying blitz. Oh, you should see these. They're still playing, actually. These adverts that are on all the Sinclair channels here in Southern Oregon, and I bet they're where you are too. Absolute fabricated lies. The old trope that other countries that negotiate their price for medicines never get to get the medicine. That lie. God. Now, experts who have analyzed the complex plan say it would offer people with private insurance some protection from the escalating cost of their medicines. The gist is that this is going to create substantial savings for seniors and taxpayers, said Leigh Purvis, Director of Healthcare Costs and Research at ARP's Public Policy Institute. This is going to reduce the price of expensive and widely used prescription drugs, and that has an impact for everyone. The Institute is a policy arm of ARP. The group's advocacy operation played a leading role, lobbying in favor of restraining drug prices. If the legislation passes, savings could be concentrated among patients with serious chronic illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and rheumatoid arthritis, along with those who take combinations of costly medicines to try to control accumulating health problems. The first tangible benefits would take about a year to show up. In 2023, the bill would impose a check on annual price increases for established drugs, as well as cost limits meant to keep insulin affordable. A huge development would follow in 2024, the first ever cap on out-of-pocket costs for nearly 50 million seniors in Medicare's Part D pharmacy drug program. That scam. Why don't they just get rid of it? A year later, the health policy centerpiece of the legislation would go live. Seniors would see the first fruits of Medicare's negotiations with drug companies for no more than 10 medications to start with, but no numerical limit on negotiated prices for insulin. Democratic campaign strategists, hoping for a quick political hit for next year's midterm elections, may be disappointed. Terms and conditions for Medicare prescription drug plans for 2022 are already set, so immediate changes would have risked disruptions. It takes a while to implement these policies, said Tricia Newman, a Medicare expert with the nonpartisan Kaiser Family Foundation. I don't think consumers will see much of an impact before the midterms. Johnson of the Associated Press brings us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. The contagious Delta variant is driving up COVID-19 hospitalizations in the Mountain West and fueling disruptive outbreaks in the North, a worrisome sign of what could be ahead this winter in the U.S. While trends are improving in Florida, Texas, and other southern states that bore the worst of the summer surge, it's clear that Delta is not done with the United States. COVID-19 is moving north and west for the winter as people head indoors, close their windows, and breathe stagnant air. We're going to see a lot of outbreaks in unvaccinated people that will result in serious illness, and it will be tragic, said Dr. Donald Milton of the University of Maryland School of Public Health. In recent days, a Vermont college suspended social gatherings after a spike in cases tied to Halloween parties. Boston officials shut down an elementary school to control an outbreak. Hospitals in New Mexico and Colorado are overwhelmed. In Michigan, the three-county Metro Detroit area is again becoming a hotspot for transmissions, with one hospital system reporting nearly 400 COVID-19 patients. Mask wearing in Michigan has declined to about 25% of people, according to a combination of surveys tracked by an influential modeling group at the University of Washington. Concern over COVID in general is pretty much gone, which is unfortunate, said Dr. Jennifer Morse, medical director at health departments in 20 central and northern Michigan counties. I feel strange going into a store mask. I'm a minority. It's very different. It's just a really unusual atmosphere right now. New Mexico is running out of intensive care beds despite the state's above average vaccination rate. Waning immunity may be playing a role. People who were vaccinated early have not yet received booster shots, may be driving up infection numbers, even if they still have some protection from the most dire consequences of the virus. Well, let's get to our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we've curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Sarah Vitak. So many of the objects we interact with nowadays run on programming and are designed with an exact purpose in mind. We don't typically think of living things as falling into this category, but more and more, scientists are programming and designing living cells and even whole organisms. This area of research is called synthetic biology, and there's a whole subsection of the field that's all about figuring out how to engineer cellular armies that can be commanded and controlled. Cells trained to search out diseased tissues, cells equipped for environmental reconnaissance, cell assassins that put out hits on other cells. Sounds cool, right? But in reality, nothing is that targeted and exact.
It's somewhat limited because those cells, to date, they don't know spatially where they are in the body. Are they in a tumor? Are they in the liver? Are they in the pancreas? Are they in the brain? So, they might try to figure that out based on molecular clues, but they don't have this kind of GPS that's telling them that they're in the right place to carry out their actions.
That is Dr. Mikhail Shapiro, a professor of chemical engineering at Caltech. His lab recently tackled this problem head-on using the power of air bubbles. Their lab had already been doing a lot of work with programming cells to create tiny structures called gas vesicles. They're basically just little air bubbles surrounded by a hard shell of protein that then float around inside the cell. You can think of them like nanoscale ping pong balls.
They have a fascinating origin. They basically evolved as flotation devices for photosynthetic microbes that live in water and need to float to the top of the water so they can get enough sunlight.
Dr. Shapiro and his team had previously been able to put the genes for making gas vesicles into mammalian cells or other bacteria. At the time, they were doing this because they wanted to use it as a tool for imaging. They were inspired by jellyfish. More specifically, something that they make called green fluorescent protein, or GFP. The good thing about this protein is that it can be genetically encoded to be attached to naturally occurring proteins, allowing scientists to view them and track where they go in living cells or animals. Using GFP as an imaging tool totally changed the game in microscopy. So much so that its discovery and development was awarded a Nobel Prize in 2008.
So we were kind of obsessed about finding something similar to a fluorescent protein, but that instead of being fluorescent, meaning interacting with light, would interact with sound waves and allow us to image it with ultrasound. And sound waves get scattered or reflected off of materials that have a different density or stiffness. And air, is very different in its density compared to tissue and water and so on.
But recently, they had the idea that maybe they could use these vesicles for other purposes. Namely, by using ultrasound to intentionally burst the bubbles.
If we just crank up the ultrasound a little bit, then we're hitting that ping pong ball hard enough that it cracks and opens.
When it does, the air is released, and you end up with a little bubble inside the cell. Alone, it wouldn't do anything. But as the ultrasound continues, the bubbles expand and contract.
And over time, several of these bubbles of air will come together and join up to form a larger bubble until it's big enough that the ultrasound causes it to undergo a strong mechanical implosion.
They started by getting this to work on the gas vesicles alone. They pulled a bunch of gas vesicles out of cells, an easy procedure because they just float to the top, and hit them with ultrasound. Then they listened in with an ultrasound mic, and sure enough, they could pick up the vesicles popping.
Humans can't hear it, but the spectrum of it looks like broadband noise. So when you turn on your TV and it's showing this kind of thing, that's what you would expect to hear if it were in the audible range.
They wanted to see it as well.
So we borrowed a 5 million frame per second camera from our aeronautics department and connected it to a microscope.
Which sounds excessive, but actually it wasn't. Sure enough, they could see the vesicles breaking and forming the bubbles, which would then pop. And all of this would happen in a matter of microseconds. Next, they wanted to apply it. So they made gas vesicles that had proteins on the surface that would bind to cancer cells. Then they mixed them up with the cancer cells in a dish and hit it with ultrasound. It worked.
Think of it as you're punching the cancer cells. So these are expanding and contracting, and they're punching and sending shock waves very locally. So that was pretty cool because, we kind of converted our innocent little imaging agent into a little bomb that we put on a cancer cell and blow it up. But we thought it would be even cooler if we could get cells to be the bomb and have those cells go in through the body and infiltrate a tumor to get inside.
So they tried the same experiments again, but this time they used bacteria that were engineered not only to make gas vesicles, but also to home in on tumors. In the petri dish, it worked. Their next step was to try inside an animal. This is where the ultrasound aspect really pays off, because ultrasound can be used and targeted to a very specific location in the body. It basically makes up for the lack of cellular GPS I mentioned earlier. So they took some mice with tumors and then injected some of these bacteria into their bloodstream. And they saw?
The bacterial cells kind of go different places around the body, but in most of the body, they get eliminated by the immune system, except in the core of the tumor, because the tumor is an immunosuppressive environment.
Basically, they were using one of cancer's key traits and adaptations against it.
And what's cool is that because the gas vesicles can serve as both an imaging agent and now a therapeutic agent, we could see with ultrasound imaging that the cells were in the tumor core and confirm that our little therapeutic agent got there and established a little colony.
Then they targeted ultrasound at the tumor. They did this in combination with a new class of cancer drugs that allow immune cells to find and kill cancer cells, known as immune checkpoint inhibitors. On average, the mice who received the bacteria and ultrasound treatment lived twice as long as the mice that only got the new cancer drugs. This is maybe just the beginning of what we can do with these little targeted missile bacteria. They might also be promising for other disease treatments, especially because you can have the bacteria carry a payload, like a drug, and then burst open to release it in a particular location.
You know, it's a great example of Mother Nature giving us this, precious gift. And it's something that actually was discovered more than 100 years ago. The first paper noticing that there are these air-filled pockets in bacteria was published in 1895. I just think it's a neat story of going all the way from, a couple billion years of evolution to then 100 years of basic biologists, poking around at them. And now these proteins finding a whole new life.
Thanks for listening. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Sarah Vitak.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
When a federal employee illegally and flagrantly uses their federal job for political campaigning, there are serious consequences, right?
I'm Baratunde Thurston from The Onion, and also, mother. You're listening to the Civil Liberties Minute with ACLU attorney Bill Newman.
The Hatch Act, which has been the law since the late 1930s, prohibits federal employees from using their federal position for political campaigning. That law has been in the news due to a recently released report by the Office of Special Counsel, a report that documents myriad violations of the Hatch Act by senior advisors to President Donald Trump, including Jared Kushner and Stephen Miller and Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, among others. Here's the rub. For senior political appointees, the Office of Special Counsel can only recommend discipline. There's no fine. And the only person who can impose a punishment is the president. And the person who violated the law can't be fired from a position they no longer hold. So the impact on these Trump appointees will be nothing. The Protect Our Democracy Act going forward would put some teeth into this law, but that legislation is languishing in Congress. The scariest part? These Hatch Act violations are yet another example of how those in power are using their power, including gerrymandering and voter suppression and campaign violations, to maintain that power. It's time to batten down the hatches.
The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2.
On this day in labor history, the year was 1954. That was the day Ellis Island closed its doors. More than 12 million immigrants had passed through its gates since it opened in 1892. Those steerage and third-class passengers coming to America were processed at the island between 1892 and 1924. They were routinely subject to medical inspections to determine they were free of disease. Legal inspections included questions regarding birth, occupation, destination, finances, and criminal record. The busiest year was 1907, with more than 1 million arriving to enter the United States. During World War I, the island was used as a detention center for presumed enemies and those considered foreign-born subversives. After Congress passed the Restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, arrivals entering the country slowed to a trickle. Then Ellis Island became primarily a detention and deportation center. During World War II, thousands of Germans, Italians, and Japanese made up the majority of those detained awaiting deportation. It also served as a military hospital for returning servicemen and training center for the Coast Guard. By 1950, Ellis Island served as a holding center for arriving communists and fascists who were prevented entrance under the recently passed Internal Security Act. A Norwegian seaman who had overstayed his leave was released the day the island closed and told to catch the next ship back to Norway. In 1965, President Johnson made Ellis Island part of the National Park Service. A massive restoration of the island began in 1984, organized by Lee Iacocca's Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. It reopened as the Ellis Island Immigration Museum in 1990, featuring numerous exhibits, publicly accessible immigration records, and the award-winning film documentary Island of Hope, Island of Tears.
Like what you hear? Check out more at laborhistoryin2.com.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Blue Moon Spirits Fridays, because we are all night hawks in the Diner of Life. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River and the Rogue River Valley of southern Oregon, on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where foggy conditions prevail. In fact, we have a dense fog advisory. Right now, the temperature is about 52 degrees Fahrenheit, expected to be a bit cooler than yesterday, only in the low 60s rather than the mid 60s. A slight chance of a rain shower, which actually just happened, so it's not so slight after all, isn't it? And it looks like we'll have some more rain showers throughout the day. Winds will be light and variable, and considerable cloudiness overnight with lows in the upper 40s, winds remaining light and variable. And then partly cloudy skies tomorrow with highs in the upper 60s, and it looks like we may be able to dry out a little bit during the weekend. But I haven't heard anything about these guys putting on the coating for my cement, so maybe they know the weather better than we do. We'll see. And it looks like, we will be having some rain towards the end of the week and maybe during the week as well, but we'll see how that goes. Almost like it's Oregon weather. Well, confirmed cases of coronavirus in Jackson County in the southern part of Oregon continues to rise. We now stand at 240,008 infections, and our deceased now stands at 338 confirmed. Pollen is rated as none right outside the window in Rogue River. The air quality index for the region is good at 18 parts per million, and the daytime UV index is low at level 2. Barometric pressure is holding steady at 30.33 inches. Visibility is less than 1/2 mile, and relative humidity is at 98%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. London is 55 degrees and cloudy. Paris is 54 and sunny. Rome is 68 and partly cloudy. Kyiv is 43 degrees and fair. Kabul is 45 and clear. Hong Kong is 67 and partly cloudy. Tokyo is 56 degrees and clear. Sydney, Australia is 62 and clear. San Francisco, California is 56 degrees and fair. And New York, New York is 64 degrees Fahrenheit with rain showers. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Vanessa Guerra and Monica Sizlovska of the Associated Press brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Thousands marched in Warsaw to mark Poland's Independence Day yesterday, Thursday, led by far-right groups calling for strong borders, while its troops blocked hundreds of new attempts by migrants to enter the country illegally from neighboring Belarus in a tense standoff. Security forces patrolled the capital for the parade, which was peaceful, unlike those in recent years that have seen violence by some right-wing extremists. Today, there are not only internal disputes, there are also external disputes. Today, there is an attack on the Polish border, March leader Robert Bakowicz said in a speech, adding that all Poles should support those who are protecting the eastern frontier. Sieg Heil! The march was overshadowed by events unfolding along Poland's borders with Belarus, where thousands of riot police, troops, and border guards are turning back migrants, many from the Middle East, who are trying to enter the European Union. Makeshift camps have sprung up in forests on the Belarusian side near a crossing at the Polish town of Kuznica, and with temperatures falling and access to the frontier restricted, there are fears of a humanitarian crisis. EU officials have accused Belarus President Lukashenko of using the migrants as pawns in a hybrid attack to retaliate for sanctions imposed on his authoritarian regime for a harsh internal crackdown on dissent. With the EU weighing more sanctions on Belarus, Lukashenko threatened to cut off Russian natural gas supplies to Europe that pass through a pipeline in his country. I would recommend the Poles, Lithuanians, and brainless people to think before they talk, Lukashenko said.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers, c'est tout.
Anonymous staff at Reuters brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Blue Moon Spirits Fridays. A court in the military-ruled Myanmar jailed American journalist Danny Fenster for 11 years. His lawyer and his employer said, despite U.S. calls for his release. from what it said was an unjust detention. Fenster, age 37, the managing editor of an online magazine, Frontier Myanmar, was found guilty of incitement and violations of immigration and unlawful association laws, his magazine said, describing the sentences as the harshest possible under the law. He is the first Western journalist sentenced to prison in recent years in Myanmar, where a February 1 coup by the military against an elected government led by Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi ended a decade of tentative steps towards democracy and triggered nationwide protests. There is absolutely no basis to convict any of these charges, said Thomas Keane, editor-in-chief of Frontier Myanmar, one of the country's top independent news outlets. Everyone at Frontier is disappointed and frustrated at this decision. We just want to see Danny released as soon as possible so he can go home to his family. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day. But you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on for, well, the rest of the weekend. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night and all weekend for all the breaking news as it breaks. And we'll meet up here on Monday, right here on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. À fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goer. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair. T'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.